Lynn Pillay.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I'd like to firstly, along with my friend and colleague Charles Chauvel, just raise a couple of issues, or agree with a couple of issues that Charles Chauvel raised around this bill, and it is relating to the piecemeal approach that the government is taking to issues around violence, around addressing violence, neglect of children. And as I have said in many speeches in this House, Mr Speaker, that we are still seeing piecemeal bills when we have a very comprehensive domestic violence bill still languishing on the order paper that would give much more enhanced protections to victims of domestic violence. As my colleague said, and I know the Minister's listening attentively, I do hope that the Minister will consider sending this bill to the Justice and Electoral Select Committee. Regrettably, I'm not on that committee anymore, but it is a good committee, and it is a very good committee, and I think for the continuity, which this government doesn't see as the strength of continuity, it would be very enhanced, I believe, by sending this bill, because it is a comprehensive piece of legislation, to that committee. Now, the bill does deal with several issues, but a particular focus is to ensure that children are adequately protected from assault, neglect and ill treatment, and that's on the Law Commission's recommendation in terms of mandatory reporting, that creating a new offence or a failure to protect a child or vulnerable adult from the risk of death, grievous bodily harm or sexual assault as a consequence of the unlawful act by a third party or the failure of a third party to perform a legal duty. Failure to take reasonable steps to protect a child or vulnerable adult, knowing they were at risk, would result in charges with a maximum penalty of 10 years of imprisonment. Now, Mr Speaker, we certainly support any measure that would prevent and mitigate the harm or abuse against our children. And I will acknowledge that New Zealand does have a shameful record in terms of some of the abuse cases that we have seen, that we see in the media, and that certainly we on this side of the House would support any legislation or indeed any other means or policies that were going to serve to give more protection to our children. So that Labor will support this bill to Select Committee, but whilst we're doing that, we just want to put on record that we're very keen to hear from submitters at the Select Committee around some of the concerns that have been raised, and that one of the concerns was that some mischievous or false reporting, and that I know it wouldn't happen in many cases, but it may lead to an overloading in those circumstances of social service agencies who we know are struggling to do a very good job with considerable cuts to funding and resources under this government, considerable cuts. But the people at the front line who are addressing and investigating the concerns around our children, that this could put considerable pressure for them. In fact, I would draw the House's attention to the Children's Commissioner, John Angus, who has said that mandatory reporting of child abuse could swamp child, youth and family. Now, we already have a high level, New Zealand has a high level of reporting on abuse incidents, and needed to respond better to those cases rather than bringing in mandatory reporting. So that is the view of the Children's Commissioner. So that we actually, in Labor, of course we will support this to Select Committee, but we feel a concern that this bill, that with the best of intentions, may not have the best results. And I know that the members on the Select Committee, be it Justice and Electoral or Social Services, wherever the bill ends up, I know that the members, certainly from the Labor side, will be listening very carefully to submissions being made on this really important issue. The other parts of the bill, that in terms of reducing knife crime, the Ministry of Justice conducted a review, and it made several recommendations, including more education of young people, as they were identified as the group that engages in the possession of knives. Now, this law, we think, will do very little to combat the problem of possession and use of knives in criminal activities. And as the Ministries of Justice recommendation, Mr. Speaker, we believe that more education is needed, that actually putting more resource, more education into the use of knives, or rather the misuse of knives, I should say, that is needed more, in fact, arguably, as limiting the sale, as is done and that is done in other jurisdictions. So, Mr. Speaker, as I said before, we in Labor certainly will not stand in the way of this bill going.
I'm sorry to interrupt the honourable member. This debate is interrupted and set down for resumption next sitting day. The House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow, Wednesday the 4th of May 2011. Haere rā, kakatiano, pomari. Good evening.